Fossil fuel subsidies, which are when governments artificially lower the price of fossil fuels, are one of the biggest roadblocks to the transition to renewable energy. Renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuels, but subsidies keep fossil fuels competitive with renewables. So, how do these subsidies work, and how can we get rid of them? The main type of fossil fuel subsidies are explicit subsidies. Now, these come in two forms: producer subsidies and consumer subsidies. To put it simply, producer subsidies make the cost of producing and delivering fossil fuels cheaper, while consumption subsidies make the final price cheaper. Examples of production subsidies include tax breaks and direct payments to reduce the wholesale price of fossil fuels, and an example of a consumption subsidy is to fix the price at the gas pump, cutting prices for the end user. The International Energy Agency and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimate that in over half of advanced and emerging economies, which is about 90% of global fossil fuel supplies, fossil fuels were subsidized by an average of $555 billion annually from 2017 to 2019. The International Institute for Sustainable Development provides an even higher average of $584 billion per year between 2017 and 2019. IISD's analysis is higher because it includes public financing such as that from state-owned firms. If governments removed explicit fossil fuel subsidies, the real cost of fossil fuels would be seen. This price hike would lead more people to choose renewables. Another type of fossil fuel subsidies is implicit subsidies. Fossil fuels have many negative impacts on climate change, air pollution, and more. All of these impacts cost money, as we have to spend to clean up the effects of these issues. Implicit subsidies are the total tally of these ignored costs. The vast majority of subsidies are implicit, as fossil fuels usually dramatically undercharge for environmental costs. The International Monetary Fund estimates that implicit fossil fuel subsidies exceeded $5 trillion in 2022, meaning $5 trillion worth of damage caused by fossil fuels was not included in their price. Again, if the price of fossil fuels accurately included the true costs of using them, they would be nowhere near as economically competitive with renewable energy, and their transition to renewables would happen much faster. In 2022, the combination of explicit and implicit global fossil fuel subsidies totaled a whopping $7 trillion. For reference, the entire annual US budget is $4.5 trillion. Proponents of fossil fuels often complain that phasing them out and transitioning to renewables is too expensive. But imagine if we had almost 2 US budgets worth of money every year that we could use to build out renewable energy infrastructure. So, how do we get rid of these subsidies? Well, it's complex. There are tons of different types of explicit subsidies, so there isn't a way to get rid of all of them at the snap of a finger. Additionally, it's even harder to remove implicit subsidies because it's difficult to find one price that accurately accounts for the negative impacts of burning fossil fuels. It's also worth noting that fossil fuel subsidies, especially consumer subsidies, are often touted as a way to reduce fuel costs and benefit low-income households, when in reality, this is not the case. Subsidies are an incredibly inefficient way of addressing energy poverty disparities, and most subsidies are structured to benefit corporations and the rich the most. The vast majority of fossil fuel subsidies are regressive, meaning the richer someone is, the more they benefit. An IMF study found that 61% of gasoline subsidies went to the richest 20% of people in low and middle income countries, while only 3% of subsidies went to the bottom 20%. And this isn't just for gasoline subsidies. Subsidies for other fossil fuels, such as diesel and liquefied petroleum gas, are similarly regressive, with most of the benefits flowing to the wealthiest people. That being said, even though fossil fuel subsidies mainly benefit wealthy people, lower income people do receive benefits from them. For example, removing subsidies causes a temporary hike in food prices because global and local food transportation becomes more expensive. Because lower income people spend a greater proportion of their income on food, they are disproportionately impacted by these price hikes. Eventually, prices will course correct as food producers and distributors switch to renewables, but in the meantime, lower income people need monetary support to buy food. Money not given to fossil fuel firms should be used to offset the effects of rising fossil fuel prices. Put simply, we need to spend money on people instead of on fossil fuels, and this has been done before. To compensate for the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, the Philippines, Indonesia, Ghana, and Morocco all introduced cash transfers and social support, which included education funds and health insurance for poor families. Similarly, in 2013, Egypt cut its support for fossil fuels by 4.3% of its GDP and used this money to support health and education. The windfall that governments will get from removing fossil fuel subsidies must be spent on a just transition. On a global scale, We need to provide developing nations with the money they need to skip fossil fuels and jump straight to renewables while they develop. And we need to make sure they have the money to address existing climate change impacts. Similarly, in the US, we need to expand renewable energy infrastructure and provide lower-income communities with the money they need to switch to renewables and adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. There is no one solution to removing fossil fuel subsidies and fighting climate change, but if we make justice a core part of our speedy transition to renewables, we will make a lot of progress. Concerns that removing fossil fuel subsidies will cause job losses in communities with few alternative employment options, or that energy prices will spike and possibly depress economic growth, are legitimate, but not at all necessary. If we focus on giving people the support they need in this transition, everyone will benefit. But if we keep going down the same road and help the rich get richer instead of supporting the people who need it, everyone will suffer. Low-income communities already bear the brunt of climate change's impacts, even though they contributed to it the least. Right now, fossil fuel companies are the biggest hindrance to removing fossil fuel subsidies. They buy off politicians and lie to the public to make sure that they can keep making money and wrecking the planet. This is why, despite promises by powerful nations to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, no meaningful progress has been made. In 2009, G7 and G20 nations committed to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. In 2016, G7 nations set 2025 as their deadline for doing so. Unfortunately, neither group has made much progress, largely because of the lack of clarity on what constitutes an inefficient subsidy. As of 2019, G20 governments had only reduced their subsidies by around 9%, and 7 of the 20 nations in the bloc had increased their fossil fuel subsidies. As of 2019, G20 nations had only reduced subsidies by around 9%, and 7 of the 20 nations in the bloc had increased their support for fossil fuels. During the pandemic, there was another increase in public money going to fossil fuels in G20 nations, and in 2022, European governments more than doubled fossil fuel subsidies to $310 billion in response to the energy crisis that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the US, Biden has talked about the need to reduce fossil fuel subsidies, but little progress has been made. In 2021, he issued an executive order instructing federal agencies to cut fossil fuel subsidies under their direct control. But the vast majority of fossil fuel subsidies in the US are controlled by Congress, which has made no meaningful progress on this topic. Climate change is here, and it's getting worse. The 10 warmest years since 1850 have all occurred in the past decade, and 2023 was the warmest year on record. In fact, 2023 was 1.45 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial revolution baseline temperatures. The Paris Climate Accords of 2015 aimed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already almost hit that limit, and warming shows no signs of stopping. Part of the reason last year was so hot was that we entered a natural temperature warming El Niño cycle, but these records would not have been shattered without man-made climate change. To stop climate change from getting even worse, we must stop burning fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy. We must stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure and phase out existing fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Unless we eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, this will be impossible. And unless we focus on equitably redistributing this wealth by implementing a Green New Deal, a just, lasting transition will be impossible.